Mr. Speaker, under U.S. law, it is illegal for you or me or any American to provide any type of assistance to al-Qaeda, ISIS, or other terrorist groups. If we broke this law, we'd be thrown in jail. Yet the U.S. government's been violating this law for years, directly and indirectly supporting allies and partners of groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS, with money, weapons, intelligence, and other support in their fight to overthrow the Syrian government. A recent New York Times article confirmed that rebel groups supported by the U.S., quote, have entered into battlefield alliances with the affiliate of al-Qaeda in Syria, formerly known as al-Nusra. The Wall Street Journal reports that rebel groups are, quote, doubling down on their alliance with al-Qaeda. This alliance has rendered the phrase moderate rebels meaningless. We must stop this madness. We must stop arming terrorists. I'm introducing the Stop Arming Terrorists Act today to prohibit taxpayer dollars from being used to support terrorists. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
My bill would put an end to this madness.
You recently introduced legislation called the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. My first question is, why is that necessary? Is that not already illegal?
That's what most people think. Most people are under the impression that if you or I or anyone that we know provided support of any kind to a terrorist person or an organization like al-Qaeda or ISIS, we'd be thrown in jail. What most people are surprised to learn is that for years our government has quietly been providing both direct and indirect support, whether it's arms, funds, intelligence, and other types of support to these militant groups who are working directly alongside, allied with, and under the command of terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS. Our government has also been providing this support indirectly through countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar, who are supporting these terrorist groups, all with this objective of conducting regime change in Syria. So my bill would put an end to this madness. My bill very simply and directly would prohibit American taxpayer dollars from being used to fund and support militant groups who are working alongside and are partnered with terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS, both directly and indirectly.
One might argue that the world is a very messy place, and sometimes we have to make choices or alliances that aren't exactly pleasant. I'm sure that's a criticism you've heard of your bill. How would you respond to that?
You know, people who can think clearly about the situation at hand would say that in no situation should we allow American taxpayer dollars to be used directly and indirectly to strengthen the very terrorist group that attacked us on 9/11. It infuriates me that this has been happening, and the American people, as they learn about it, are mind blown that this is something that has been happening essentially in the dark of night. This is not a complex question. It is a simple question, and those who refuse to stand up and be held accountable in this way cannot defend this policy. As you know, this is something that I've been talking about for years, that we need to stop the destruction that's been caused by our country continuously getting involved in these counterproductive regime change wars that not only end up strengthening our enemy in groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda, but they actually end up causing more suffering for the people in these countries where we are intervening, as in Syria now.
I know you feel that way about Syria and Libya and Iraq. Do you feel that way about Afghanistan?
Afghanistan is a little bit of a different situation,
right, okay.
but yes, essentially.
You met with Donald Trump 2 weeks after he was elected. There was some speculation that he might offer you a cabinet position or some sort of position. Were you hoping to work in the Trump administration?
I love my job. The people of Hawaii chose to rehire me again in November, and I look forward to continuing to work for them. My goal in going there, in receiving the invitation to speak to President-elect Trump, was to speak specifically about the situation in Syria, the dangerous consequences of escalating the regime change war that the United States is fueling there, along with countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and Turkey, escalating that through a so-called no-fly zone or safe zone, and urging him to end our regime change war there, to stop funding, both directly and indirectly, groups that are working with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and to stop funneling those dollars and weapons and other assistance through these other countries like Saudi Arabia, who are directly supporting these terrorist groups, who are supposed to be our enemy, who we're supposed to be fighting to defeat.
And tell me about the legislation. You have a bill that you introduced today that would address loopholes you say have allowed American taxpayer dollars to fund terror groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. Are you really suggesting that the U.S. government is funding these terrorist groups?
I'm not only suggesting it. This is the reality that we're living in. And
not directly,
most
though.
Americans, you know, if you or I were to go and provide money, weapons, or support or whatever to a group like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, we would immediately be thrown in jail. However, the U.S. government has been providing money, weapons, intel assistance, and other types of support through the CIA directly to these groups that are working with and are affiliated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
So you're saying the CIA is giving money to groups in Syria, and those groups are working with al-Nusra and ISIS?
There have been numerous reports from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal and other news outlets who have declared that these rebel groups have formed these battlefield alliances with Al-Qaeda, that essentially these Al-Qaeda groups are in charge of every single rebel group on the ground fighting in Syria to overthrow the Syrian government.
Now, the U.S. government says that they vet the groups that they give money to very, very closely, and that you're wrong. There are not alliances between groups that the American taxpayers fund and these other groups. Obviously, they all are fighting Assad.
I beg to differ. Evidence has shown time and time again that is not the case, that we are both directly and indirectly supporting these groups who are allied with, are partnered with Al-Qaeda and ISIS in working to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad. And we've also been providing that support through countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar to do that.
Well, one of the first people, and definitely one of the first Democrats Donald Trump met with after his election was Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. The two met on November 21st to talk over, among other things, U.S.-Syria policy. At that point, by the way, Trump had chosen only the White House Chief of Staff and his Attorney General. Interesting. Now, Representative Gabbard has sponsored a bill she says will bar the United States from supplying weapons to ISIS or other terror groups. And she joins us now on set. Congressman, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you very much, Tucker.
So I was just really struck by that. You were one of the very first people he met with. Now, you issued a press release, and I'm sure some of you're a liberal Democrat, I think it's fair to say. Some of your constituents must have been confused, and you issued this statement. You said, I felt it was important to take the opportunity to meet with the president-elect now before the drumbeats of war that neocons have been beating drag us into an escalation of the war to overthrow the Syrian government.
That's right.
What did you mean by that, I guess, beyond what you said? And do you believe that the president-elect agrees with your views on this?
I have long been outspoken about the devastating problems with our U.S. policy, generally on interventionist wars, and very specifically on the need to end our counterproductive regime change war to overthrow the Syrian government. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives, millions of refugees, and the counterproductive result of this has been that these groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups who we proclaim to be our enemy have ended up growing stronger. So understanding that we have a new commander-in-chief coming in, president-elect coming into office very soon, I took the opportunity to be able to get across this message to him. As a veteran, knowing and seeing firsthand the cost of war, I felt it was critical to do my part to try to help influence this new administration and extend this call to action to them to end this counterproductive war that has caused so much devastation.
So what was his response?
It was a very good conversation. He had some very good questions, and he was very receptive to the message that I was bringing. And frankly, this is an area that is not partisan. This is an issue that both Democrats and Republicans should get behind, to stop arming terrorists, to stop this action that has not only caused devastation, but again, it has resulted both directly and indirectly strengthening those whom we are supposed to be trying to defeat.
Right. Well, actually, there's bipartisan disagreement with you, as you well know. So your bill is called Stop Arming Terrorists. You've introduced it. And your idea, as I understand it, is, look, the average American, you, me, not allowed to send weapons or aid terror groups.
We would be thrown in jail.
But the U.S. government, as a matter of policy, arms and aids these groups for a bunch of different reasons, but that's happening.
Well, and this is the problem, Tucker, is that there's a double standard here. That for years now, our government, working with countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Qatar, have been, through the CIA, quietly been arming and supporting these groups that are directly working with groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, all in this effort to overthrow the Syrian government. They've been funneling support through countries like Saudi Arabia and others who are also, again, directly supporting these groups. This is madness that this has been allowed to occur for so long, and madness that we have allowed the devastating consequences to occur as a result without checking it. And that's exactly what my bill does. The Stop Arming Terrorists Act very simply prohibits using American taxpayer dollars through any agency, overt or covert, whether it be the CIA, the DOD, or any other agency, from directly or indirectly providing weapons, money, intelligence, or other types of support to these groups that are allied with and working with groups like Al-Qaeda, as is happening right now today in Syria.
Well, you obviously have been listening to some famous members of the Senate who've described those groups as freedom fighters, and you just don't understand how great they are.
Clearly. This is the problem, though, Tucker, is that only recently, this has been happening for years, but only recently have a few people in the media actually started talking about the truth of what we have been doing,
right,
about how our taxpayer dollars have been spent there, and this fallacy that there are so-called moderate fighters trying to overthrow the Syrian government just is not the reality today.
When
it
you
doesn't
see
exist.
U.S. weapons in the hands of Islamic extremists and terrorists, you have to ask how that happened, and I'm glad you're asking that.
Yeah. Well, we're asking it, and we're trying to solve it. So, you know, I'm urging your viewers, we're trying to urge every member of Congress to sign on to this very sensible bill that is good for our country and good for our security.
Well, Godspeed.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Aloha.